Welcome to the second part of our discussion of American foreign policy between the Civil War and U.S. entry into World War I. Now, let's look at China. We discussed China briefly in the first part of this lecture. You may recall that in the mid-1890s, China was defeated by Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War. And this surprised many in the United States and Europe that the small island nation of Japan could defeat China. Well, over the next few years and during the 1890s in general, the major European powers such as Russia, France, Germany, and Britain set up what they call spheres of influence or areas of influence in China. They did not colonize China in the classic sense of taking over an area, declaring it part of the territory of the home country, setting up a governor, etc., etc. But they said that they were dividing up their areas of influence in China for political influence, largely commercial markets, because the Europeans, like the Americans, saw China as a virtually unlimited market for their products. Now, in 1899, shortly after the victory over Spain in the very short Spanish-American War, where the U.S. now felt confident, felt like it was a world player, the Secretary of State, John Jay, just came out and announced his open door policy. And in this policy, the United States insists that all nations have the right to compete fairly for China's business, and none could seize Chinese area or region. Now, this was basically based in the desire to exploit the huge China market. The United States did not want a small area. It wanted the whole market. It was confident that its companies could compete. And many Americans like this because they said, we are better. We are morally better than the Europeans because we oppose imperialism. We don't want to carve up China. We just want a fair and level playing field for our companies. We are not an imperial country, they would say, like the Europeans. And remember, from American independence until World War II, Americans would describe themselves as essentially not being European and being morally better than Europeans. And after World War II, Americans started to define themselves increasingly as anti-communist until the end of the Cold War. We'll talk all about that later. So here's a cartoon. Down at the bottom it says, a fair field and no favor. And we have in very small print, which you can squint and read, Uncle Sam says, I'm out for commerce, not conquest. So there we have a confident Uncle Sam, symbol of the United States, holding his arms out and keeping behind him the Europeans. Now, we have in the front a depiction of China. It says on the back China. It's obvious it's Chinaman. And Uncle Sam has just given him a bag that says U.S. Commercial Expansionist with model railroad engine. You can see their model bicycles. And the United States is confident that because of its industrial might and technological prowess that it can outcompete the Europeans. Also, the U.S. is not an imperialist country, according to Americans. So who do you have behind him? Well, you see on the right of Uncle Sam, the man with a raised fist and a helmet with a spike. That's Germany. And then right to the left of Uncle Sam, the man with a beard holding a rifle with a bayonet. It says Russia on his crown. That's the Russian Tsar. But right on behind the Russian Tsar In fact, it looks almost like he's sitting on his shoulders. He is, actually. That's a Frenchman. It says France on his hat. And to the left of Uncle Sam, the small man with two pistols, actually says on his hat, Italy. Well, in the very back, you have a heavyset gentleman lifting his hat in approval, and that's Britain, the caricature of Britain with John Bull saying, "Here, here, we can compete on commercial grounds." As I mentioned, these are the background reasons for the open door policy, and many Americans said this just proves we're morally superior to the Europeans. This is a bit, think back to 1820, the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. just came out and said no European power can come back, take over a former colony or establish new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So this is a bit like this, but this is in Asia. Now back with Theodore Roosevelt. I will see a lot more of Roosevelt in the next discussion of the Progressive Era. His diplomacy, he himself characterized as big stick. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Roosevelt became president after McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. An anarchist, you recall, is someone who basically believes in no government. So here in 20 years, we have two assassinations. We had Garfield assassinated, you recall, by someone who had actually worked on his presidential campaign and expected to get a nice job afterwards and didn't. So, my God, he went and killed Garfield. And now we have McKinley assassinated. Roosevelt, or known as TR, really transformed the role of the U.S. in world affairs. As a person, he championed what he called the strenuous life. If you have time, sometimes it's wonderful to read some of his early books where he talks about going out and being a cowboy. And he grew up rather sickly. He was from a very wealthy family, part of the Roosevelt family. He's related, we'll see later, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But he was frail, and so he used to lift weights all the time. In fact, he was too sick to go to school for a number of years, to elementary school, and he had a tutor. And he would run, he'd camp out in the woods. He really built up his body through bodybuilding when, there weren't any gyms to go to or anything. And then after college, he was very intelligent, had good education. He went, shocked everybody by deciding to go to be a cowboy, and that was part of his image, the Rough Rider. And we'll see in the next class how he loved the West, and he actually set up the national park system. So his motto, and he said this was an old African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. So here we see a cartoon at the time from one of the newspapers. This has to do with Panama. We'll talk about that in a minute. And here you see Theodore Roosevelt depicted sitting on a U.S. warship, carrying a big stick. And behind him are other U.S. warships. So he was very much the symbol of American military intervention, of which there was a lot in Latin America. We'll see in a minute. Here we have another cartoon. I love these cartoons. The big stick in the Caribbean Sea. We see Roosevelt, who as a gentleman has taken his shoes off, tied them up on his belt, and walking barefoot through the Caribbean Sea. You notice on his belt he has a dagger, a knife, and he also has a pistol. He's carrying the big stick. It even says big stick. He's very proud of this. He would see these political cartoons and roar with laughter and say, "That's me, you got it, very good." And what is he pulling behind him? Well, just like a kid pulling a toy boat, he's pulling U.S. warships. And the one you can see right in front says debt collection. If countries owed money to the United States and they claimed they didn't have the money, no problem. The U.S. Navy went in, took over the main port, for instance, Veracruz in Mexico, and put U.S. sailors there. We didn't take over Mexico, but said, we collect the tariffs here. We take the money to pay back your debt. This happened in other countries. So you see all these ships. And you can see in the foreground here, Santo Domingo, that's the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Mexico, Panama, Venezuela. I'll show you a map in a minute or two, but all these countries, the U.S. intervened, not to take them over, but as colonies, but rather to collect debts, or in certain cases, get involved in their internal affairs. So Theodore Roosevelt is usually referred to as Teddy Roosevelt. Why is he called Teddy Roosevelt? Well, I don't know, when I have face-to-face classes, I say, I like the show of hands. How many of you had a teddy bear when you were small? And usually about 90% of the people raise their hands, and one or two students say they still sleep with their teddy bear, and they offer to bring it in class, and always someone brings it in the next class, and we all have a chuckle. They're named after Theodore Roosevelt. Don't worry, this won't be an exam. I think this is fascinating. History is full of fascinating anecdotes. So your teddy bear, if you had one, is named after Theodore Roosevelt. In many shopping malls, there are stores called Build-A-Bear. I don't know if you've seen them. You go in and they basically you can get, well, not just a bear, you can get lots of little stuffed animals or stuffed people or whatever, and you put the stuffing in and you buy ornaments and stuff. But the classic is the teddy bear, right? I had a teddy bear when I was a kid, and my brothers did. So, it's not just a girly thing. At least when I was growing up, everybody had a teddy bear. Sort of comfort when you're a kid, okay? So what happened was, let me tell you the story here. This is from a political cartoon at the time, and this is what happened. Theodore Roosevelt was very wealthy. He loved the outdoor life, fishing, hunting, you name it. So he went down on a train when he was president, to the state of Mississippi. He had some political business nearby, and he decided to go hunting there because there were black bears in the forests, and he loved hunting. So he'd been there a day or two, and he hadn't killed a bear yet, and he was quite upset. So he said, look, I'm going to have lunch. And he loved to eat. He was a robust man. He had a huge meal, and he told his associates, you go out and find me a bear to kill, tie it up to a tree or chain it up, then shoot your gun 3 times as a signal that you've got a bear. I will finish my lunch, and then I will go out and kill the bear. Now, doesn't seem very sportsmanlike, but that's what he was planning to do. And that's what sort of was done by the wealthy people in those days. So Theodore Roosevelt is having his nice lunch, and he hears 3 gunshots. Well, he finishes his lunch and his dessert and goes off and finds a bear tied up to a tree. Well, the bear, according to Theodore Roosevelt and others who were there, was almost a cub. It was a fairly small bear. It was a bear, but wasn't a baby, but it was, it looked small. It was very thin. It looked like it had been sick. And Theodore Roosevelt looked at the bear and said, this is not sportsmanlike just to kill a bear that's about, looks like it's dying of starvation. And so he said, let it go, let it live. I'll go home without a bear. And that's why the cartoon said, drawing the line in Mississippi. He said, no, no, no. I'm not going to kill that sickly-looking bear. Well, so what happened? This was reported. There were political cartoons. People kind of chuckled. Most people said, he's a real man. He'll only kill a big bear. Of course, he was prepared to kill the bear that others had somehow captured and tied up. But anyway, so the United States has many entrepreneurs, people who are very good at business ideas. And, and if people like their idea, they can make a lot of money. I don't know if there's a good program on TV called Shark Tank, rather, when you see people take all their ideas to these investors and it makes you realize the creativity of the people. Of course, most of the people don't get money and lose money, but someone thought, well, this is people talking about this little bear. Let me make a little bear for children, a little stuffed animal bear, and I'll start selling it and call it the teddy bear after Theodore Roosevelt. So, so manufacturers started selling them, and there was a big success. He had to increase production in his factories, and Teddy Roosevelt even bought one, and here he is photographed with one. There's rough, tough Theodore Roosevelt with his little teddy bear. A cute little bear, and he loved it. He loved the publicity. Remember his Rough Riders and all? He loved the publicity. This was just great publicity. It showed that he was a great outdoorsman, but he drew his line at killing a little bear. And it was, the photos were all over the U.S. Everybody was buying teddy bears for their children, and people still have them. Here's another photo. This is Theodore Roosevelt in his presidential office. You see the map of the world there, symbolizing American power. And what is right up there above the fireplace? His teddy bear. From here on, he was often photographed with his teddy bear. In fact, if you go to Mississippi, you can see a plaque along the road that in 1902, President Roosevelt went to Smeads to hunt. On November 14th, Roosevelt refused to shoot a captive bear. Cartoons of the event are thought to have led to the creation of the teddy bear. And so this has now become, there's a historical marker in the state of Mississippi. Okay, now let's go back to the substance of the course. I thought that was an interesting deviation. Now, he was really the first, what we would call an activist president. He became very involved, not only in foreign policy, but as we'll see in the next lecture, pushing legislation to guarantee pure food and drink and medicine and set up national park system, et cetera, et cetera. So we're used to activist presidents now, but Teddy Roosevelt was the first one. And he used to refer to his bully pulpit. A pulpit, of course, is the place in a Christian church where the priest or minister gives a sermon and tells the people to live a good life, et cetera, et cetera. And he said bully, like he's going to be there, not like a bad bully in school, but with his large, energetic self urging people to move along. Now, in Panama, in the southern part of Central America, there were some rebels who were fighting the government, and Theodore Roosevelt very much wanted to get permission from the Panamanian government, from the Colombian government, because Colombia controlled that area, to build a canal. And he wanted to buy the land because the United States didn't want to invest in this and get companies to invest unless they owned the land. Well, the Colombian government said no. Well, fortunately, there were some people in that area rebelling against the Colombian government. So Theodore Roosevelt sent the U.S. Navy down to keep the Colombians away and recognize these rebels as an independent country. So, and they agreed, of course, in recognition of the assistance, to grant the United States land in Panama. And that land was given for 100 years, and it was called the Canal Zone. It was part of the United States, a territory of the United States. It was the area of the canal and 10 miles on either side of it. And then, just by the way, when that treaty, the land no longer belonged to the United States, there was a big ceremony and the land was given back to Panama. But until that time, the Panama Canal was on American territory. And in fact, if you were born in the Canal Zone, you were an American citizen. This became an issue. Presidential election recently, when John McCain was the Republican candidate, and some people questioned whether he was qualified because the U.S. Constitution states that you must be born in the United States. And it was determined, well, the Canal zone in Panama was part of the United States, a U.S. territory, and therefore he was eligible to be elected president. Of course, he lost the election. But so the Panama Canal, now the French had tried to build a canal through Panama, but it tried very hard. They had great technology, but they gave up. The company went bankrupt because they had 20,000 deaths from disease, largely yellow fever. Well, the first thing that had to be done was to conquer yellow fever. So the U.S. Army sent down a group of Army doctors, and they determined what caused the yellow fever, a certain kind of mosquito. And so what they did is they drained all the water they could in the whole Panama Canal zone. And when they couldn't drain water, like for lakes and stuff, they covered them in oil. And the oil prevents the mosquitoes from laying eggs and wipes out the mosquitoes. So what they did is they essentially wiped out all the mosquitoes for 10 miles in either direction. Was not very environmentally responsible, because they would just, lakes would be covered with oil, and when the mosquitoes were gone, that was fine, and all the standing water. And they also came up with eventually with a vaccine. Well, the U.S. continued. It's a fascinating effort to see how it was done. Another 20,000 workers did die, though, in the U.S. effort. And it finally opened in 1914. Now, Roosevelt visited the canal when it was under construction, and this is the first time a U.S. president had left the country while he was in office. He was harshly criticized for doing so. And of course, this is a time where he couldn't just hop on a plane, fly to Panama, look at the canal, and hop back in the day or two. It was quite a trip to go there by boat. And people were also concerned, about the risk of disease. Now, the Panama Canal, which is obviously still in operation, greatly reduced the transit time to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean or vice versa. For instance, the route you see on this map from the eastern coast of the United States to the western coast, the red line before the Panama Canal was 21,000 kilometers. And you can see it went all the way around South America, and the tip of South America is some of the most dangerous sailing territory in the world for vessels because of the storms and whatnot. But that was cut to 8,000 kilometers, by more than 50% by the Panama Canal. So it was really, really a major advance, and not just for the United States. Many other countries could use it. Anyone could use it who pays the fee. This is the Panama Canal today. And this is of just general interest. You can see what they did is they sent surveying teams down. And the lake you see there was sort of man-made. They put some dams in. There were some little lakes there, but rather than digging through all the land, what they did is they created as much waterway as possible, which is obviously. But that said, they had to cut through mountains, and they did have steam shovels by this time, but it was still a major, major effort. And they cut through it, and this is a view of the canal in operation with the locks. If you took the first half of U.S. history with me, I had a little video on how the locks work to move the ships up and down between different levels of water. Here you can see large passenger ships going through. The issue in recent years is the locks in the canal are not wide enough for the very, very largest container ships to get through. So what they've been doing is expanding some of the locks, and there's also consideration for building another canal elsewhere in Central America. Now, in 1904, as President Roosevelt came up with the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Excuse me. You'll recall that in the original Monroe Doctrine of 1820, President Monroe had just come out and said the Europeans could not interfere in internal affairs of Latin American countries. They couldn't recolonize former colonies, nor could they establish new colonies. Now, Roosevelt came out with a corollary. The corollary means, well, this is consistent with the Monroe Doctrine, and said in certain instances, the U.S. was justified to intervene in Latin American countries to prevent the Europeans from doing so. So in other words, Roosevelt said, if we think the Europeans might intervene, we go first. Also, the United States intervened in a number of Latin American countries, particularly around the Caribbean, take over some customs houses to make sure that U.S. banks that had made loans were repaid. This is a cartoon from the time, and this is in support of Monroe, President Roosevelt. We have a U.S. warship. It says Monroe Doctrine at the end, and here we have, right at the end, what's depicted is a greedy European king who is trying to grab this poor peasant in, we don't know where it says Republica, some island or country in Latin America, and the U.S. warship is protecting the person. This is the message of the cartoon, at least. This is an interesting map of the Caribbean. First of all, here you see in dark green the United States. And you'll notice that apart from the United States, from Florida over, the small island of Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It was annexed in 1898. And then if you look, and it's still part of the United States, and if you're born in Puerto Rico, you are a U.S. citizen. And often there are votes in Puerto Rico asking the people if they would like to become a state, become an independent country, or keep their current status. And until fairly recently, actually, most of the people say they like the current status because they're U.S. citizens. That means they travel the U.S. without passports, whatever, but they do not pay U.S. federal income tax on activities in Puerto Rico. So it's kind of, they view it as the best of both worlds. Excuse me. Then we see in lighter shade of green Cuba, which was sort of a protectorate of the United States. It was occupied, and then you can see it was a protectorate until 1934. And you can see on the eastern end of Cuban island, Guantanamo, it says U.S. Naval Base. To this very day, that is a U.S. Navy base on the island of Cuba. I won't go through all these, but well, next to Puerto Rico, you see the Virgin Islands. Those were purchased from Denmark in 1917. They are part of the United States. And they're also, so they're called the U.S. Virgin Islands because right next to them are the British Virgin Islands, which is very complicated. So if you're flying to the Virgin Islands, you may or may not need a passport depending on which one you're going to. Let's look down there at Panama. We just talked about Panama. You can see the United States controlled Panama from 1903 to 1939. But the Panama Canal Zone was that little strip around the canal. That was leased from Panama in 1903, and 100 years later, it was actually returned to Panamanian possession, and it continues to be part of Panama. And finally, there in Nicaragua and Central America, you can see, if you squint, a proposed route for a canal across Nicaragua. This would be for a canal, a wider canal, the locks and all wider for the very largest tankers, and it would take advantage of a large lake that's already there in Panama, in Nicaragua. Obviously, that's a major investment. Now, Roosevelt was president till 1909. He was reelected in 1904. In 1908, another Republican, William Howard Taft, succeeded Roosevelt. At this time, there was no limitation in the Constitution on how many terms of office a president could have. That was added later, but Roosevelt thought, well, 2 is enough, and let's keep up that tradition. And so William Howard Taft succeeded Roosevelt after the election of 1908, in early 1909. And Taft really focused on so-called dollar diplomacy. He said, we really need to promote U.S. commercial and economic interests abroad. Remember, the U.S. is a major industrial power now. And in addition to promoting U.S. commercial interests, Taft was not shy about intervening in countries that the United States thought had political and economic turmoil. And sort of Nicaragua comes to the top of the list because U.S. Marines were sent in many times. Then in the 1912 election, the Democrats won, and the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president early 1913. We'll see Wilson a little more later in the course. He was an academic president of Princeton University, and he became president. He sort of, during the campaign, said he was against all this intervention, but actually, once he became president, he intervened more in Latin America than Taft and Roosevelt combined. So we had Wilson quite enthusiastic to intervene. And here we had Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Mexico. Now, the last slide, you certainly don't need to know all these. I'm not going to ask you certain dates, but I'll speak slowly here, so it's on your screen for a minute. You can just see all of the U.S. interventions during this period. I've gone over some of them. You can see Cuba, many sort of interventions, U.S. troops in Honduras, Nicaragua. Look at Nicaragua there in Central American. And it's in purple. It's like quasi-protectorate. The U.S. ran Nicaragua for so many years. It was like, the U.S. went in and basically felt the country was incapable of ruling itself. And so they just moved in. But needless to say, you could see there was a lot of U.S. intervention in the area. And none, sort of in South America per se. Excuse me, except a little in Venezuela. Okay, this concludes our discussion of U.S. Foreign policy between the Civil War and the First World War. And from here, we'll move on to domestic policies in the United States and look at the progressive era, which is from 1900 until the First World War. Thank you.